A mother will walk through fire for her child, but sometimes the real flames are the fears we carry inside us. "Mom, please don't turn off the light." Those were the words that froze Emily in her tracks one ordinary night. Her daughter Leela wasn't just scared. She was trapped in a fear so deep it reminded Emily of something she had buried for decades. And what happened next would push a mother to confront the very darkness she'd spent her whole life avoiding. If you're watching this right now, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps stories like this reach more people who need them. Emily had always believed she understood fear. As a single mother raising her bright, sensitive 8-year-old, she thought she knew every emotion on her daughter's face. The spark of excitement when she learned something new, the scrunch of frustration when she got stuck on her homework, the warm, sleepy smile she gave right before drifting off to bed. But fear, this kind of fear, was new. It started subtly at first. Leela began asking for a third nightlight. She refused to walk down the hallway alone, even in daylight. Emily brushed it off as childhood imagination. Just a phase, she told herself. Kids get scared, kids grow out of it. But deep down, she recognized something in Leela's trembling voice, something painfully familiar. It reminded her of a darkness she had never truly faced, the kind that still lingered at the edges of her own mind. And though she had never spoken of it, not even to herself, those shadows were waking up again. As the nights grew heavier and Leela's fear grew stronger, Emily realized this wasn't just about shadows in a room or lights being turned off. This was a story about connection, about history, about the silent weight mothers carry without meaning to. It was the beginning of a journey neither of them expected, a journey into the heart of fear itself, and the courage it takes to walk through it holding the hand of the person you love most. The house had the kind of silence that felt like it belonged to a photograph, still, familiar, safe. I remember the way the hallway light hummed, the small clock over the kitchen ticking the way it always did, a rhythm that usually meant everything was all right. That night, though, the ordinary sounds seemed to shrink away around Leela's voice. "Mom, please don't turn off the light." She said it small, like a secret. I went into her room because you always go when a child asks you for something you can give. She sat up in bed, blanket bunched under her chin, eyes huge and bright in the warm glow. There was sweat at her temple, a tremor in her fingers. When she looked at me, I thought for a second she didn't recognize me, only that she recognized danger. I told myself it was just a nightmare, the kind every child has. I smoothed her hair, tucked the blanket up, left the door ajar and the hallway lamp on. I left a soft nightlight by the corner of her bed that hummed like a friend. The next morning, she clung to me as if we'd both been through a storm. At breakfast, she pushed her cereal around her bowl without eating. At school, she didn't play with the other children. Her teacher sent a note. Leela seemed distracted, she said, withdrawn during circle time. I read the note twice before I let myself feel the cold little pinch inside my chest. Mothers are supposed to be able to fix things. We are supposed to mend skinned knees and broker playground disagreements and convince our children that monsters aren't real. I tried those things. I told jokes. I bought a new stuffed animal that came with a tiny nightlight. I made up a silly song about the no monster zone. Leela smiled on the surface, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. That's when the small signs started to add up. An extra request for the light. Her refusal to go down the long hallway alone, even in daylight. The way she'd pressed the back of her hand to her chest when the power went out for the briefest moment. One afternoon, she clutched my hand so hard in the grocery store that I felt the bones in her small fingers through my palm. She whispered, "It's waiting." Like she was confessing something impossible. I asked what it was, and she only shook her head. eyes squeezed shut as if she could hold the thing back with her lids. It was surreal and ordinary at the same time, a child saying something impossible in a voice so plain it made my throat ache. I started to watch her more closely. I started to watch myself more closely. There were patterns in how Leela reacted. Old houses made her fidgety. Long shadows made her pause. Thunder made her lips go white. I wondered if I had overlooked something obvious, some trigger I had brought into our small life without noticing. I delved into the quiet work of a mother detective, reading articles on childhood anxiety, talking to the pediatrician, testing different routines at bedtime. Each attempt felt like a soft light pressed against a wall of water. There was movement, but the pressure didn't break. Leela's nights grew longer, not in hours, but in the way the fear took up the space between us. Sleep became a fragile negotiation. Who would give first? Who would stay up later? Who would say the calming lines? And who would believe them? And then there was the night the hallway light failed. The bulb gave a tiny pop, and everything went blue-black. Leela's breath hitched. I felt something old and iron-cold awaken under my ribs. For a moment, I couldn't tell whose fear I was answering. I reached for the flashlight, then stopped, because the way she looked at me, raw and honest, asked for something different. She needed me to be more than a rescuer. She needed me to be a companion in that dark. I knelt down, took her hand, and we sat on the bedroom floor in the faint glow of my phone screen, sharing stories that had nothing to do with monsters. The time her cat got stuck in a tree, the day she learned to tie her shoes. Her breathing slowed. Mine did too. It felt like a truce. But truce is small when you're facing is a map of memory that runs both ways. The truth was waiting at the edge of that pause. The realization that Leela's fear looked eerily like something I had spent decades burying. If one frightened child was a thing I could handle with story and light, two frightened hearts stitched together by the same old seam meant something else entirely. And that something else was the beginning of a choice I had to make. Do I keep protecting her the way I always had, by putting a light between her and the dark? Or do I step into the dark beside her and see what we both might find? Rewatching that night, you can almost hear the universe holding its breath. In the dark, we both decided we would not let fear decide our story. But the next choice, how to walk forward, would test more than resolve. It would test the roots of memory itself. What Emily discovers when she traces the edges of Leela's fear back into her own past changes everything, and it's not a thing she expected to find. For most of her adult life, Emily believed she had outrun the shadows of her childhood. She built routines, lit her home with warm lamps, kept herself busy, and filled every quiet moment with sound. Music, podcasts, the hum of daily life. Silence had always made her uneasy, darkness even more so. But she never spoke about it, not even to herself. To her, adulthood was supposed to mean moving forward, not looking back. Yet every time she saw Leela trembling in dim light, every time her daughter froze at the sight of a dark corner, something inside Emily pulsed with a memory she thought she'd locked away forever. It happened when she was 9. She had followed her older brother into the basement. A dare, nothing more. The kind of thing siblings do for fun, thinking fear is just another game. What she didn't expect was the sudden slam of the heavy wooden door, the click of the chain lock, and the pitch-black silence that swallowed her whole. Her brother swore later he hadn't meant to lock it, but intent didn't matter to a trapped child who couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. The dark was so complete, it felt physical, like a weight pressing against her skin. Emily remembered screaming until her voice cracked. She remembered scratching at the door until her nails bled. She remembered the shame of being pulled out hours later, shaking, coughing, barely able to breathe. Nobody in her family ever talked about it again. They told her she was being dramatic. They said it's just a dark room, not a monster. She learned to swallow her fear whole and pretend it wasn't real. Over time, she built a life around avoidance. No basements, no dark theaters, no camping, no power outage nights where candles were the only light. She moved through adulthood with a quiet, controlled grace, never revealing the small flutter of panic that still rose whenever the world dimmed. She thought she had buried it deep enough that Leela would never inherit it. Parents make that promise to themselves. Our children will not carry what we carried. But fear doesn't follow logic. It follows lineage. On the day everything clicked into place, Emily was sitting at the edge of Leela's bed. It was daylight, the curtains open, the room filled with soft afternoon glow. Leela had just finished explaining her latest nightmare, one where she wasn't alone in the darkness, where something stood beside her, breathing softly, waiting. As she spoke, her small hands twisted in her lap, knuckles white, eyes glassy. And then Leela whispered something that cut straight through time. "Mom, the dark feels heavy, like it's pushing." Those were the exact words Emily had once said at 9 years old. She said them to her mother, who didn't understand, who shut down the conversation because it was easier than facing the truth that her daughter was hurting. Emily felt her throat tighten. She touched her chest lightly, almost surprised at the tremor she felt behind her ribs. She could see her younger self reflected in Leela's trembling shoulders, the same way fear sat like a stone between their hearts. But this time, unlike her mother, she wasn't going to walk away. She wasn't going to silence a fear she herself once carried so painfully and so alone. That night, when the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the house settled into evening quiet, Emily went into her bedroom closet and dug out an old box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were remnants of her childhood: broken crayons, a faded hair clip, and a small flashlight, the one her father had given her the night after the basement incident. She held it in her palm for a long moment, thumb tracing the cold metal. The flashlight didn't work anymore, but the memory of gripping it so tightly her hand hurt came rushing back like a storm. She sat on the floor breathing shakily. For the first time in decades, she let herself remember not the event, but the emotion, the helplessness, the shame, the silence. And underneath it all, the truth she had ignored for too long, she was still afraid of the dark. Not metaphorically, literally. And that fear, unspoken, had seeped into her daughter's world like water through cracked walls. Realizing it felt like the floor shifting beneath her. If she wanted to help Leela escape the grip of fear, she couldn't keep pretending she was untouched by her own. She would need to turn toward the very thing she had spent her entire life walking away from. And yet the scariest part wasn't the darkness itself. It was admitting that she was still that 9-year-old girl deep down, still trapped, still terrified, still waiting for someone to open the door. Emily doesn't yet know it, but the moment she faces her own shadow, every step she takes with Leela will become far more dangerous and far more powerful than she ever imagined. Emily began noticing the subtler signs, the ones that slipped past a casual glance, the tiny tremors and hesitations in Lila's day that spoke louder than words. It wasn't just bedtime anymore. Lila flinched when shadows stretched across her bedroom floor in the afternoon. She refused to step into the basement, even to retrieve the laundry. When a power outage struck the neighborhood, she clutched Emily's arm like a lifeline, shaking so hard that Emily's heart threatened to break in two. She tried to reassure her daughter, tried to laugh it off, but it became increasingly clear this was no ordinary childhood fear. It had roots deeper than storybooks and nightlights, deeper than imaginary monsters. At school, teachers mentioned Lila's quietness, her distraction, her unwillingness to participate in group activities that took her to dimly lit corners. Emily spoke with them, explained that Lila had anxiety, but the usual advice, structured routines, extra attention, gentle encouragement, barely scratched the surface. It was frustrating, watching her daughter shrink from experiences that should have been joyful. And when Emily sat in the quiet of her car after school pickups, she realized with a sharp jolt that the fear wasn't just about darkness. It was about control. Lila felt powerless in a world that didn't understand her panic, and Emily, despite every effort, had never felt more powerless herself. She started keeping notes, times of day when Lila seemed more anxious, triggers in the environment, patterns in her nightmares. She observed how long it took her daughter to settle when frightened, how her tiny hands clenched into fists or rubbed at her arms. Emily read about childhood phobias, panic responses, and the psychology of inherited fear. Every article she absorbed added weight to a truth she didn't want to acknowledge. She couldn't fix this alone. Not with distraction, not with logic, not with promises that it'll pass. Lila needed something far more profound. A mother willing to go deeper than explanations and comforting words. One night, Emily tried a small experiment. She dimmed the hallway lights slightly, watched from the bedroom doorway as Lila walked slowly down to the kitchen. Her daughter froze mid-step, eyes wide and unblinking, a bead of sweat forming at her temple. "Mom," she whispered almost inaudibly, "it's watching me." Emily froze too because those words, they weren't just imagination. They carried the resonance of her own childhood terror, that same sensation of being observed in the shadows when nothing else was supposed to be there. Emily realized the fight wasn't just for Lila, it was also a confrontation with her own past. The patterns she was seeing mirrored her own reactions at the same age. Avoidance, withdrawal, panic. Every time Lila recoiled from shadows, Emily felt a pang of recognition, a cold echo of memories she had long repressed. It was a strange and uncomfortable merging of past and present, mother and daughter, fear and courage. Determined to act, Emily began crafting a careful plan, small steps to gradually expose Lila to situations that triggered her anxiety. Dim lights, brief trips into previously forbidden rooms, gentle encouragement to explore corners of the house she avoided. Emily paired these exposures with conversations, naming fears, talking about what might be waiting in the dark, imagining a protective force beside them. Each step was slow, painstaking, and emotionally exhausting for both of them. There were setbacks, tears, resistance, even anger. Lila sometimes shouted, sometimes ran to hide, sometimes clung so tightly Emily worried she would break her child in the effort. And yet every small victory was celebrated. A corner crossed without panic, a hallway navigated with whispered reassurance, a night without a single request for extra lights. Slowly, Emily noticed a subtle shift. Lila was learning that fear could be met, even challenged, and that she was not alone in facing it. The turning point came one stormy night. Lightning flashed and the power went out. Lila panicked immediately, shaking violently. Emily felt her own chest tighten, a flash of memory from her basement nightmare threatening to surface. Instead of reaching for a lamp or distraction, she knelt beside her daughter, held her hand, and whispered, "We're here, together. Nothing can touch us while we're together." Lila's breathing gradually slowed, and Emily realized this was the work, facing fear side by side, sharing the weight, refusing to let panic control the moment. And as she held Lila in the dim glow of their phones and the occasional flash of lightning, Emily understood something profound. The fear wasn't going to vanish immediately, but love, presence, and courage could teach a child something stronger than panic: resilience. What Emily didn't yet know was that facing these small fears was only the beginning. The storm outside the house wasn't anything compared to the storm within, and the next step would demand a bravery neither of them had experienced before. Emily knew that the small victories, though meaningful, were only the beginning. The nights of dim lights and careful reassurance had taught both her and Leela something crucial. Fear doesn't vanish on its own. It must be approached, acknowledged, and sometimes confronted directly. One evening, after tucking Leela into bed and watching her drift into uneasy sleep, Emily sat alone in the living room, flashlight in hand, reflecting. She realized that if she truly wanted to help her daughter, she couldn't continue shielding her from every shadow. She would need to face the darkness herself, not just for Leela, but for the child she once was. The decision wasn't easy. Emily remembered the way her body had stiffened in that basement so many years ago, the terror that had been locked away, the shame of admitting it existed. Confronting it now, even as an adult, made her stomach twist in knots. But watching her daughter tremble at the same invisible weight had awakened a determination stronger than fear. She whispered softly to herself, "We'll do this together. I'll never let you face the dark alone." The next morning, she shared a quiet plan with Leela, framing it like an adventure rather than a challenge. "Tomorrow," she said, "we're going to explore the house together after bedtime. Only little steps, only together, and I'll be right here with you." Leela's eyes widened. There was fear there, yes, but also trust. Trust that her mother's hand would not falter, that her presence would be unwavering. Emily smiled gently, squeezing her daughter's hand. It's okay to be scared. Being brave doesn't mean you aren't scared. It means you do it anyway. They started small. The first night, they walked together into the hallway with the nightlight dimmed. Emily held Leela's hand tightly, narrating every step with calm, soothing words. She told Leela to notice the shadows, to name them, to imagine them shrinking as they passed. Leela's breath was shallow at first, but gradually steadied. They returned to her room and celebrated each completed step, a ritual of small victories, stickers on a chart, whispered cheers that made Leela giggle through the tension. Over the next few nights, Emily escalated the exposure gradually but carefully. They ventured into darker rooms, sometimes with only a flashlight, sometimes with just the faint glow of the moon through the window. Emily spoke openly about her own fear, sharing her childhood memory of the basement in ways that made it less intimidating. A story framed with honesty, humor, and love. "I was scared too, and I didn't have anyone with me, but now I have you, and we're brave together." Leela's response was tentative at first, a whispered, "Really?" Then a firm grip of her mother's hand as they stepped forward. Emily also introduced playful exercises to reclaim control over fear. They called them bravery points, awarding stickers for every small act of courage, walking down the hall alone, turning off the light for a few seconds, entering the closet together. They used deep breathing, counting exercises, and imaginative storytelling to replace anxiety with empowerment. The process was slow, often frustrating, but each day ended with a tangible sense of achievement. The most profound shift, Emily realized, wasn't just in Leela. It was in herself. Holding her daughter's hand while stepping into the dark, narrating courage aloud, acknowledging her own childhood terror, these acts chipped away at decades of avoidance. She discovered a quiet, raw strength that she hadn't known existed, a bravery born not from fearlessness, but from love. By the end of this stage, both mother and daughter had transformed. Leela's panic attacks had decreased, and she began exploring rooms previously forbidden, her trust in herself and her mother growing. Emily, in turn, no longer felt the tight knot of fear in her chest when darkness fell. They had begun the journey from avoidance to empowerment, and the bond between them had deepened in ways that words could scarcely describe. But the true test was yet to come. One night, when the storm would cut off every light in the house, both Emily and Leela would face the darkest challenge of all: a challenge that would demand every ounce of courage they had discovered together. The nights of small victories and cautious exploration had built a foundation, but Emily knew that true courage would be tested in the moments that demanded more than careful steps. One evening, a storm rolled in, casting the house in shifting shadows even before the power flickered. Leela clutched her mother's hand tightly as the wind rattled the windows. Emily could feel her own pulse quicken, not with fear of the storm, but with anticipation. This was the opportunity she had been preparing for, a real test of the lessons they had been practicing, fear faced together. They started with a ritual they had grown familiar with over the past week. Emily lit a single candle, placed it on the nightstand, and held Leela close. "We're going to do something brave," she whispered. "You'll be surprised how strong you really are." Leela nodded, though her eyes betrayed the tremor in her heart. Emily knelt beside her, guiding her through deep breaths. Inhale, hold, exhale. She counted aloud, giving Leela something tangible to anchor her attention to. Slowly they moved toward the hall, the candle casting long shadows that danced along the walls. Leela hesitated, then pressed her hand into her mother's, drawing strength from her presence. Each step was deliberate. Emily narrated softly, turning fear into language they could confront together. "See the shadows? They're just shapes. They can't hurt us. Watch how they move when we walk by. Look how small they get when we face them." Leela's voice, initially trembling, began to mirror her mother's calm tone. They reached the basement door, a place that had haunted Emily's memories for decades. She opened it slowly, hand holding Leela's, and together they peered into the dim space. The storm rattled above them, lightning flashing briefly through the small basement window. Emily's pulse hit her ears, a reminder of her own childhood terror. But she didn't falter. She whispered, "We're here, together. Nothing can touch us while we're together." Leela's small nod, a mixture of fear and trust, felt like a victory that would echo far beyond this night. They ventured inside, step by cautious step. Emily shared stories from her own childhood in a way that made the darkness less threatening. She laughed at herself when she recalled her younger self panicking over shadows, making Leela giggle despite the tension. Humor became a tool, courage a practice, presence the strongest shield. They stayed until the candle burned low, breathing together, counting together, allowing the darkness to exist without giving it power over them. Over the following nights, they repeated this ritual, slowly extending the amount of time they spent in dim or dark spaces. Emily introduced small challenges, turning off lights in other rooms, walking down the hall alone for a few seconds, closing closet doors and opening them immediately. Each success earned encouragement, praise, and bravery points. Leela began to notice that fear didn't need to dominate her body, that she could move, breathe, and even laugh while it existed. Emily saw the transformation too. Her own pulse, once tight with remembered terror, relaxed in tandem with her daughter's growing confidence. There were setbacks. Some nights the storm of fear returned with a vengeance. Leela would cry, cling, or even shout. Emily would feel her own anxiety rise in response, but instead of withdrawing, she leaned in. They would sit together on the bedroom floor, sharing stories, counting breaths, reminding themselves that fear could be met and managed. The breakthrough was gradual, measured in inches, not leaps. But inch by inch, they were reclaiming control over the darkness that had once felt insurmountable. The most powerful lesson emerged during these nights. Fear is not defeated by absence or avoidance. It is faced and shared. Leela discovered that courage exists not as the absence of fear, but as action taken despite fear. Emily rediscovered that her own childhood terror, once a secret shame, could be transformed into a source of empathy and strength. Together, they learned that facing fear side by side created a bond stronger than any shadow that tried to intrude. By the end of this stage, Leela could move through dimly lit rooms with confidence, and Emily felt the weight of her own fear lighten significantly. They had not just survived the darkness, they had tamed it together. The house that once held shadows of dread became a place of shared triumph and quiet empowerment, a space where fear existed but no longer controlled them. But the ultimate challenge was still ahead. One stormy night would test everything they had learned, pushing both mother and daughter into a darkness that would demand every ounce of courage, love, and trust they had built. This night would not only confront their fears, it would define their bravery. The storm came suddenly, a violent sweep of wind and rain that cut off all light in the house. The familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic disappeared, leaving only the sound of the storm thrashing against the windows and the heavy heartbeat of fear in Leela's chest. She clung to Emily, trembling, eyes wide and filled with panic. "Mom, I can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. Emily felt her own chest tighten, memories of her basement incident rushing back in sharp, visceral waves. Every instinct told her to shield Leela, to turn on the lights, to make it all go away. But this time, she knew that hiding from the darkness would teach nothing. Instead, Emily knelt beside her daughter, holding her hands tightly. "We are going to do this together," she said, her voice steady, though inside she felt every old fear stirring. "I'm right here, Leela. Nothing can hurt us while we're together." The words weren't just for her daughter. They were a lifeline for herself, a reminder that she was no longer that 9-year-old girl trapped alone in a basement. She had a hand to hold now, a child to protect and empower, and together they could face what once seemed impossible. The first few minutes were agonizing. Leela's small body shook, her breathing came in rapid, shallow bursts. Emily mirrored her instructions from previous nights. Deep breaths, counting together, visualizing the shadows shrinking and losing power. She narrated each step softly, telling Leela exactly what to do with her eyes, hands, and thoughts. "Watch the lightning flash. It's just light, passing quickly. Feel your feet on the floor. We are safe. We are brave." Gradually, Leela's trembling slowed, though her grip on Emily's hand never loosened. They moved slowly through the darkened house, room by room. The familiar rituals, counting, naming fears, imagining courage, became anchors in the storm. Emily whispered stories of her own childhood, including the fear she had once kept secret, framing it as a shared adventure rather than a scar. Leela began to mimic her mother's calm tone, repeating phrases like, "I am safe, I am brave," with increasing confidence. For the first time, Emily saw her daughter not as a frightened child, but as a young partner in facing fear, a reflection of courage in its purest, most vulnerable form. When they reached the basement door, the sight of Emily's most haunting memory, her pulse threatened to betray her calm. But she held Leela's hand, taking a deep breath, and whispered, "We will go in together. I will not let fear control us." They opened the door slowly, shadows stretching across the walls, thunder shaking the windows, lightning illuminating the empty space for brief flashes. Leela's breath caught, but Emily guided her step by step, showing that movement and presence could overpower panic. For the first time, they stood in the basement together without hesitation, without retreat. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, they returned upstairs, hearts pounding but steady. They had not just survived the storm, they had faced it, shared it, and emerged stronger. Leela's face was flushed, but her eyes held a light that Emily had not seen before. The darkness had not vanished entirely, but its power over them had diminished. Fear was still there, but courage, trust, and love had grown stronger in its place. In the days that followed, Leela's confidence increased. She moved through previously avoided rooms with minimal support. She slept alone, turning off lights for the first time in months. Emily, too, felt lighter, freed from the shadow of her childhood fear. The bond between mother and daughter had transformed. They were partners in courage, proof that fear could be met and overcome when faced together. But even as the storm passed, a new question lingered. What other fears, hidden and unspoken, might challenge them next? And would the courage they had forged be enough to face the next darkness that life might throw their way? The days after the storm were quiet. But in that quiet, something profound had shifted. Lila no longer clung to the nightlight with desperate fingers, and her steps down the hall were unhurried, confident. She moved through spaces that once made her freeze, her laughter returning like sunlight filtering through clouds. Emily watched her daughter with a mixture of relief and awe, realizing that the child who had once been paralyzed by shadows had begun to reclaim her world. Each small victory, each fearless step, was a testament to the bond they had forged in the heart of fear. Emily noticed subtle changes in herself too. The old tightness in her chest, the phantom tremors in the dark, had eased. She could now walk through dim rooms without her pulse racing, talk about her childhood fear without flinching, and sit with Lila in darkness without instinctively trying to fill it with light. The process had been painstaking, exhausting, and emotionally raw, but it had reshaped her understanding of courage and love. She realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to move forward despite it, and that lesson had been imprinted on both their hearts. They developed new rituals that reinforced this courage. Nightly reflection became part of their routine, talking about moments that had been challenging, celebrating victories, and preparing for the next small step. They kept a journal together, drawing pictures and writing down thoughts and fears, turning the abstract weight of anxiety into something tangible and manageable. Emily introduced gratitude exercises, encouraging Lila to focus on things that brought joy, however small. Through these practices, fear became a companion they could understand rather than an enemy controlling their lives. Life gradually returned to a rhythm where shadows no longer commanded authority. Lila started to approach school with renewed confidence, participating in activities she had once avoided. She shared stories of bravery with friends and sometimes even laughed at moments that would have previously terrified her. Emily noticed that each time Lila faced her fear, it reinforced the lessons they had learned together: courage, patience, trust, and the power of shared experience. But perhaps the most profound change was in their relationship. Emily and Lila had discovered a depth of trust that only arises when someone has faced the most vulnerable parts of themselves with another by their side. The bond between mother and daughter had strengthened not just through reassurance, but through shared triumphs over fear. They had walked into the darkness together and emerged not just unscathed, but stronger, more connected, and wiser. Emily reflected on the journey they had taken, from trembling in a dark bedroom to confronting the storm head-on. She realized that fear, though inevitable, was not permanent. What mattered was the courage to face it, the presence of someone to walk beside you, and the willingness to embrace vulnerability as a source of strength. In teaching Lila to confront her fears, Emily had also healed pieces of herself, breaking the cycle of silence and avoidance she had carried since childhood. The house, once heavy with anxiety and shadows, now felt warm and alive. Nights became peaceful, moments of darkness no longer terrifying. Lila slept soundly in her room, occasionally reaching out for her mother's hand, only to realize she could manage on her own. Emily smiled quietly, knowing that both of them had grown stronger than they had ever imagined possible. Fear is part of life, but it does not have to control it. Courage is not about being unafraid. It is about stepping forward despite it and sharing that journey with those we love. Emily and Lila's story is a reminder that the darkest moments can lead to the brightest transformations, and that the bonds of love can turn fear into strength. Their journey didn't just end with surviving the night. It ended with embracing life fully, with bravery, connection, and hope.